You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we are talking about the 1964 horror movie, Castle of Blood. Here we go. All right, Nick, Castle of Blood. I think in the entire time that we've known you, Nick, Pete and I have heard you talk about Margheriti and Castle of Blood. If there was like a bingo card, Pete, I think we'd have it filled up and then some.
You are not wrong, Bernie.
So, Nick, you're on the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. Pete, co-host extraordinaire.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
A little bit about Nick. You can find him at nickdiak.com. You can find his essays, blogs, links to social media. He's a writer, pop culture scholar, and co-host of the HP Lovecast Podcast, dedicated to the works inspired by Lovecraft. But we're not talking about Lovecraft today. We are talking about kind of Edgar Allan Poe, because we're talking about 1964's Castle of Blood.
Castle of Blood. This is the shocking drama of a young writer who disregards the warning of his master, Edgar Allan Poe, and accepts a wager to pass the night in a castle of mystery and legend. No one has ever witnessed and survived the awesome secrets, the ghostly events of this Castle of the Damned.
I've dreamed of this night. At last I can go away with the man I love.
You can't leave, Elizabeth. You're trapped in this castle.
Here, the dead rise from their tombs once a year to repeat their hideous crimes of murder and passion.
Kiss me. Keep on embracing me. I want to absorb the warmth of your body.
For a moment, I thought that your heart had stopped.
I'm dead, Alan.
Every death is repeated tonight. Come.
No, Elizabeth.
Edgar Allan Poe's most gripping, chilling drama of horror and suspense. Castle of Blood.
I love it. It should be on the same tier and talked about in the same breath as like Mario Bava's Black Sunday. It's not. And so I have made it one of my side missions in life to make sure that people know about Castle of Blood. So much so that little Nick, Nick 13 years ago, when Nick was working on his master's degree in film, decided, hey, what should I do my master's thesis on? Let's do it on Castle of Blood. And he did. This how I got there. That's its own story. We'll probably get into that. But by doing so, probably was the big Pandora's box that got me into a lot of stuff. Diving into Castle Blood, I had to dive into the career of Margheriti, which in turn meant I had to dive into Italian cinema as a whole, from silent age to neorealism, 80s Star Wars knockoffs, movies like Yor. I had to take it all in. Doing that at the same time also had to make me dive into exploitation cinema. So it was just a huge Pandora's box of film studies, film culture, learning about new films, learning about how films are perceived at different times and different countries, appreciating genre cinema, appreciating, B cinema, that aside from what it offers to the audience, its place in cinema as a whole, both culturally, artistically, and economically, all condensed down to this not even Edgar Allan Poe knockoff gothic horror story that I adore.
Well, Pete, I can speak for myself. I've never seen this film until last night. Yep. But how about you, Pete? Where are you on Castle of Blood?
I think the great thing about our podcast and our friendship and having people like Nick on is that we've got like these three spheres that are contact juggling their way in and out, but they're translucent. So like the overlap is there. And now we're hitting the Venn diagram. So all that being said, like you, I had never seen Castle of Blood until last night watching it. And there's a lot going on there. And as we've talked about with a lot of these movies that are first time watches, I found myself very intrigued. Mid-60s Italian horror has a lot of elements, I thought, of early Hammer horror, having not really remembered The Pit and the Pendulum and those early like Corman
adaptations. I don't know how much this adhered to that, but like certainly that opening of our lead walking into the tavern where Edgar Allan Poe is spinning his yarns definitely gave me some Hammer horror hooky spooks of, like walking into the tavern in Transylvania while Dracula's castle is high above. So I was immediately intrigued, and there's a lot to like about this film. To me, it drags a little bit in the middle. The beginning is very interesting to me, drags a bit in the middle. The end comes around. I think it's served by the fact that your protagonist, as it were, is kind of in the dark, sometimes literally, as to what's going on. And you're kind of uncovering the information, even though it's teased out in various points. But there was we'll get into this. I thought about this after the fact. I didn't get it originally while watching it, but as I was thinking more on it, there's a great subversive lesbian angle to this film that, as I thought more about it and was rethinking some of the lines that were spoken, really hit home. And I'm like, oh, this is operating on a different level. And yes, it's kind of a B movie. It's a little bit of a knockoff, but there's stuff going on there. So I quite liked it. Bernie, what were your thoughts?
Same. I think you echoed a lot of my sentiments. I wasn't sure what we were going to get. Nick has shared a lot of recommendations with us, and they've all been good. There are times when if you listen to Nick on one of the episodes, you just know when Nick's going to Nick. Because when we got into Sword and Sandal or Peplin Cinema, like he gave us a masterclass on not Conan, but like all the movies that were inspired by Conan that did not have the budget of Conan, right? And with this movie, I was like, okay, I'm into horror. I definitely like Hammer horror. When I think of those Universal monster movies we grew up with, they always felt like those are my dad's horror movies. And I remember when I first discovered Hammer horror, again, prepubescent teen. So you have buxom women, bright red blood. I'm like, yeah, this is my horror. And even then, it was older, but it felt like, oh, this is how I connect Universal monsters. Like, this is my Dracula, my Frankenstein. So when I saw this, I'm like, okay, this feels, like you said, has echoes of Hammer horror. But I'm like, this was made in 1964, and I like context. So I was like, all right, let me check out what was out around this time, because I think this movie actually feels older than what it is. So 1964, Mary Poppins, Goldfinger, My Fair Lady. Okay, this movie feels like it looks so much older than all of those films.
Yeah.
And then in 1964, we also get Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, which has a very purposeful black and white production. In that lens, this was then, I imagine, made. And if we only had someone on that had written a paper on this, we'll find out, I'm sure, soon. It feels like it was a movie that was made to have an older production value sentimentality to it. A lot of good horror tropes. We've seen that before in movies like House on Haunted Hill, 13 Ghosts, of course, Ghost and Mr. Chicken. That idea of someone being motivated to stay in a haunted house by winning a bet, and then supernatural hilarity ensues. But obviously in this, with the Edgar Allan Poe piece, the gothic aesthetic to it, okay, this is kind of cool. But like you said, there were so many things in there that, and again, Nick I'm sure you'll elaborate on this. I felt like I did you a disservice, Pete, because when you look for Castle of Blood on YouTube, you will get through a few pages of the full length versions of this movie. And if you see the running time on them, you realize that they're not all the same. There's a few with a few minutes less, a few minutes more, in some cases up to like 8 or 9 minutes more. And there's like a dozen versions of this film, it seems like, and certainly the nudity and the more risque elements were not the one that I sent you the link for. So I feel like I robbed you of some good old fashioned nudity, Pete. And I apologize for that, because I think I sent you the clean cut.
Well, that's fine, because I did a little reading up again after the movie had ended, because I always get intrigued by these things, like how did this get made? Like I think you're spot on. Like, it feels like a much older movie than even the time. It feels older than 1964. This feels like a late 50s just from the look of it. But I think that's to its credit in a lot of ways, because I think the use of lighting and shadow in this really brings out that creepiness factor, certainly early on, when you're really trying to figure out, like, okay, because again, for those of you that have not seen this, Bernie, you kind of set it up like journalist arrives at the tavern, meets Edgar Allan Poe. He's been trying to get an interview with him. Edgar Allan Poe's telling his stories. He's like, it's kind of set up in a world where Edgar Allan Poe's stories are real, and trying to say like, no, this is just in your mind. There's a gentleman at the table who owns a castle saying tonight is the night where I see if I can find someone that'll take this bet to stay in the castle overnight, knowing no one has won it yet. People have died, and he gets the gentleman, Alan Foster is the character's name, to do the bet. And things happen very rapidly after that, and we get into our story. So it has a good hook. It's not a hook that we haven't seen elsewhere before, but again, like you're drawn into this, and it's like, okay, so let me see how this is going to unfold. And like I said, like you got like, all right, are we dealing with ghosts? Is this something that's in his mind? How are we going to find out about this? And I think now is a good time to turn it back over to Nick to kind of delve into more of what our initial thoughts were, but to get into more of his love for this movie and where he found this going.
I actually hadn't watched it in numerous years since I had to watch it a billion times for my thesis. I was shocked at one, how much it held up. Two, that I'm still discovering new stuff about it while I was rewatching. Like, oh my God, I can't believe I missed that. Oh my God, I can't believe I missed that. So Bernie, context-wise, why is there a lot of versions of this film and where did it come from? So Italy at this time, very late 50s through the 60s, was kind of in an economic boom, and they were flush with cash. And that trickled to its cinema. Italy had like the most prolific cinema industry of the 60s, and not just like high level, Fellini type stuff, but the genre films. So basically Hercules kickstarted all that. Hey, we can make big historic epic films that are just as good at a fraction of the budget. Let's align our, cinema production to that. And, from that spawned Euro spy, spaghetti westerns, macaroni combat, giallos, gothic horror, and so on and so forth. And as they're cranking out these films, these are very international productions. What I mean by that is you could have like an Italian director with, an American main cast, but, you're shooting in Spain because it's spaghetti Western. So you got, Spanish production crew and everything like that. And then your second tier stars might be other Italians and whatnot. And, the director doesn't speak English. So they'll say, just say what you got to say. We will dub it later and we will edit it later. And that's what they did. They will just make a movie. Main character's talking in English, second character's talking in Italian, third character might be talking in French. Doesn't matter. They're going to get dubbed later. It's going to get edited later because these movies are going to be shipped out to different markets. Depending on those markets, they're going to dub accordingly, and they're also going to insert our extract accordingly as well. So, example, the nudie cut of Castle Blood that shows, a topless lady, which was very progressive at the time. And I'll get into that because that's like the crutch of my thesis. They were going to show that in Italy, but they could show that in another country. So, snip out for the Italian cut, but, keep in for another cut. And then at the same time, you had companies like AIP. There was a big relationship between AIP and Italian production at this time that AIP would import a lot of these films and redub them and recut them and everything. So that's why there's a lot of versions of Castle Blood, is that it was made with to be exported out as a global commodity, to go to America, to go to Germany, to go to stay local to Italy, go somewhere else. And each of those would have its corresponding dub and its corresponding cuts to correspond with what was okay to show in that country. In fact, the version of the movie I have, which is from Synapse Films, it's a combination of cuts. They took cuts from the French version and cuts from the Italian version and merged them together. So sometimes characters are speaking English, some of them are speaking Italian, and it's subtitled. But nowadays you can cobble a film together like that to get what might be considered a true version. But there isn't a lot of true versions of Italian films out there because, if you watched a true version, it'd be incomprehensible because, again, everyone's speaking everything else. It's like you could watch a true version of Godzilla, And then you can watch an edited version that has Raymond Burr. You watch the Raymond Burr edit, but you could say, I want to watch the real version, and you can go out and grab Godzilla and watch the real version. A lot of Italian films, you can't do that. And let me rephrase that. A lot of Italian genre films, you can't do that. The higher level stuff, the Fellinis and whatnot, their movies are still their movies. They're the auteurs.
When we think of the Spielberg, the Scorseses, the Fellinis, it's their singular vision. But then the fact that you said auteur, and then earlier on you said commodity, which is such a weird way of looking at a film. The production is proactively taking into account the fact that you may shoot a scene that will not be intended to be seen in certain markets, and that you're doing that on purpose. It's such an interesting aspect of filmmaking, but also one that, like you were saying with the Italian film industry, one that they seem to lean into in order to not only make things, but actually be able to distribute it outside of Italy themselves, like into other markets.
Right. And some of that was also exporting out to like erotic markets. You can make a movie pornographic in Italy. You have two characters that embrace each other in the bed, cut, go somewhere else, film two extras and show some what I mean, and splice that in. Now you got an X-rated cut of a movie, and Italians did that all the time in the 70s.
Just for the record, interrupt you, Pete, I did send you you did not know what they mean because you didn't see it cut version, so just letting you.
So yeah, there's X-rated versions, uncut versions, so a lot of these Italian films. And, we've talked about Peplum before. Some of these movies only exist, like, here is the American edit of a TV version of a Hercules film redubbed as a Son of Hercules film. That's the only way it exists. You can't find this movie in any other way because, again, it was a commodity. Who cared? Let's toss it. So, some of these older Italian genre films, from Eurospies to Peplum to Gothic horror, they exist in these miserable states that, they were the export version that was cropped, edited, redubbed, and that's just what you have. And Castle Blood, I don't want to say suffers from that per se, but there's multiple versions of it out because of that. Now, how did this movie come about, in its time and place? Well, late 50s, early 60s, there was a big horror boom going on. You had AIP had struck gold a couple years earlier with their Corman making their Edgar Allan Poe films. So, House of Usher, just came out with Vincent Price. And that just opened the floodgates for all these Vincent Price horror films that were, a lot of them were Edgar Allan Poe, Tomb of Legia, Pit and Pendulum, House of Usher. Some of them were like Lovecraft, like the Haunted Palace is Lovecraft and not Poe, but hey, there's Vincent Price there. So AIP was cranking out these Gothic horror films. And the crazy thing, even though their AIP was a good chunk of them were like good. I mean, the first House of Usher film is like legit good. It's a good Vincent Price film. It's a good Gothic horror film. And then at the same time, Britain is having their Hammer horror surgence going on as well. Quartermass Experiment came out a couple of years earlier. Then, all of a sudden the boom of Christopher Lee and Grand Moff Tarkin movies are coming out.
It's funny you brought up the Hammer horror and the Quartermass Experiment, because you always have to differentiate like the X in Experiment, because that's when the BBC had issued like the X certificate.
Oh,
and
really?
the idea was that, and it wasn't like what we think of like XXX. Like it was like X meant that it was adult only movie, not adult pornographic or erotic, but it was adult in nature. Like I guess closer to like R-rated R now. So then the folks Hammer, they licensed the Quartermass Experiment from like the original serial from the BBC, and then they changed the name to Experiment, as in the letter X, to let audiences know if you're an adult and you want to see something that's a little bit more horrifying, a little bit more thrilling, a bit more adult and less serial, less pulpy, then come see this movie. And then that actually like leaned into the tone of how they handled Dracula and Frankenstein and the Mummy after that, where it was, here's bright red blood and here's women that, the cleavage is hanging out. It's like leaning into that X rating to let adults know this movie is for you. So it seems like that was a time, Nick, where like all this stuff is happening and then kind of feeds into Castle of Blood too.
I will bring up large breasts very much so in a second here, because that's actually not that I'm a chauvinistic dude, but that's extremely important here in a minute in Italian cinema. But I actually didn't know that about Quartermaster Experiment. So at this time, America's churning out Gothic horror, Britain is churning out Gothic horror, and we all know the reactionary nature of Italians. We got to make our own Gothic horror. And the thing is Italians had not been making much horror films. When Italian cinema kind of died after World War II, kind of crushed it for a bit. What was popular was the neorealism cinema, pink neorealism, dramas, and kind of stuff like that. You didn't have a lot of fantastique, that's the word I'm going to use, or speculative fiction type films for a while. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it took Riccardo Freda to make I, Vampira, which was in the 50s, to kind of, hey, we can make horror films. It's okay to do. And but then it took, a couple years later, Bava and Freda cranking out their stuff, Black Sabbath, Black Sunday, like, okay, we have a legit market here. And that kind of helped open up the floodgates of, we have kind of two streams of horror going on. The giallo just took off, and now this Gothic horror stream is taking off as well. And so Castle Blood is built into that Gothic horror market of we got Hammer stuff, we got AIP stuff, and AIP has a big, I think I said that before, a big relationship with Italian production stuff. They bring their stuff over and cut it and distribute it, and AIP has done stuff over there too. So why not? Why not leverage what we know, what we can do? And so Castle Blood falls into that era of early to mid 60s Gothic horror. And unfortunately, I think it's overshadowed by Bava and Freda incredibly. If I can take back the clock to when I was doing my master's thesis, one of the reasons I did it was, I had to pick a thesis, and I knew I wanted to talk about film. The things that you want to do in film studies and when you're writing your thesis is, what is the question that you can answer that hasn't been answered before? What's the knowledge gap you can plug? And at this time, I was fully submerged in Italian cinema. Margheriti's name kept getting brought up, but it was always overshadowed by Bava, Freda, and Argento. And I think Margheriti is a way distant, fourth place. And here's Seth, and that was one of my claims in my paper was, Margheriti's not that bad. He needs some reconsideration. And now here we are 13 years later, and I don't think he still got that. Castle of Blood is still, in actually almost all of Margheriti's films, even though, we're now in the era of boutique DVD Blu-ray companies cranking out super 3-disc box set limited editions of Zombie with 10 commentary tracks and everything. All these other directors continue to get reassessed and reappraised. And I don't think Margheriti has had that, and let alone Castle of Blood has had that. I don't know. I don't know why that is, because I think he's fantastic. So talking about why this film's important. Pete had alluded to it with lesbianism, and Bernie, you alluded to it with boobs. And again, not to sound too sexist, but that's exactly why this film's super important. What kind of triggered my master's thesis way back in the day was I had a book called Italian Sexy Comedy. And all this is a picture book showing stills from Italian sex comedies of the 70s. But the foreword of the book made an offhanded statement saying that you couldn't have the Italian sexy comedies without the Italian horror, because the Italian horror was that realm of you could start showing things, blood and sex, and kind of get away with it in the culture at the time, because during the 60s, Italy was very religious, under the Christian Democrats' reign, for lack of a better word. So that's why Pepla flourished, because a lot of them were biblical tales. So, you can have big old scenes of violence and beefy guys beating up people and vamps dancing around because, it's biblical, or someone gets their comeuppance. You could do that in horror films. You could show blood and nudity and other things, so long as a moral is upheld. And so a lot of Italian horror films and giallos and whatnot could be risque and exploitative. They can start pushing those boundaries of showing things, so long as, at the end, people are punished or rewarded accordingly. That statement from the book kind of really stood out for me, of that the horror cinema was a good experimental ground to get us to Italian sex comedies. Well, what came before that? What did you have before, though? What did you have before Italian genre films and horror films if you couldn't show sex and nudity? Well, there is a phenomenon in Italian cinema in the 50s, maggiore fisica. I cannot say that, but it basically means buxom beauty. And what you had in the 50s was the emergence of these very dominating Italian actresses who were endowed in the chestal area, but they were also like in personality and presence and everything. They were just these powerful actresses. This is where you have Sophia Loren. This is where you have Gina Lollobrigida, that they dominated the screen. And, they didn't get like naked or anything, but, because of their body types and their curvature and stuff,
That reminds me of what is it? Raquel Welch is 10,000 BC. Right.
And that's where the Italian cinema was going in the 50s, with folks like Sophia Loren leading the way, because she was, so iconic and built and just powerful in physicality and presence. But, these weren't sex movies these folks are in. These weren't Italian sex comedies, because fast forward to the 70s, we're in the era of post-golden age of porn in America, post-French Emmanuel films, where it's all off, the sex comedies where women in lingerie running everywhere, or, as I said earlier, they shoot a film and insert some X-rated scenes into it. That's just late 60s through the 70s, and here's this period in the 50s. Two way different spectrums of displaying sexuality in cinema for an otherwise very chaste country. So how do you get there? And that's where I was thinking their kind of statement was offhanded, but I'm like, no, this is a bigger deal than they think it is the exploitation ground. And the exploitation ground has always been a good place to be transgressive and to push the boundaries. And so for Castle of Blood, it is, I think, the second Italian film to actually show overt nudity. And, for us nowadays, it's tame. It's extremely tame. We see there's a sequence where a married couple comes into the titular Castle of Blood, I suppose you call it. They're on their honeymoon. The guy goes to check, the local ghost haunting the dining room. And so the lady disrobes, and all she has on is this, I think the term is hoop ring skirt. But, the older, Gothic Victorian era, the ladies wore the dresses that were really wide, that had all these layers, and they had this basically like an upside down umbrella is the best way to call it. All she's doing is she's wearing that. And it's very translucent, so you can see her figure, and she has her breasts exposed. And it's a fraction of a second. But, the audience that's watching this, they're in public theaters in the burbs and rural areas of Italy. Yeah, oh my God, they're showing boobs. That's so cool. But still, that's a big deal, because you're not supposed to show that stuff at the time. How dare you show nudity in this film? Well, guess what? The lady gets bitten by a vampire ghost. So she is accordingly punished for her transgressiveness of showing nudity. So guess what? It's okay. We're clear to show that. And then the lesbianism. This is the first Italian film to show lesbianism. And I think I've read somewhere that it might be one of the first in cinema, period. I don't think that's true. I'm pretty sure there's some experimental films or Dorsch Wishman films before this, but we'll go with that. And it's subtle. There's Barbara Steele and another character named Julia, and Julia is killing all these men who are after Barbara Steele, and she wants Barbara Steele to herself. And the way it's written and acted, you could probably take it a couple different ways. Just a dominating person, I want to control you, but it's really code for she wants Barbara Steele's character, Elizabeth, as a lover. And there's a scene where they're in bed after Julia's killed a couple folks, that she's, trying to, you're mine, you can't escape me. But the way the camera is and when it cuts, away, like her hands were on her breasts, fondling her and getting close and everything. And again, it's not like a lesbian scene that we'd see like nowadays, but watching the scene then, it's obviously a woman pining after another woman, still very conservatively though, sexually assaulting her and doing bad things. And of course, Barbara Steele says, "Oh, hell's no," letter opener to the trachea. But put those two together. You had a scene of female nudity, and then you have a scene of lesbianism, and then here's to top it all off: these are ghosts; they're dead. So there is an element of necrophilia as well. When our lead character,
Foster,
arrives and he is smitten with Barbara Steele's Elizabeth's character, they make love. The camera pans away, but the implication there is, like you do in the old films, you hug and kiss and pan away, but you totally made out. He just had sex with someone that was dead. So you have this film that has lesbianism, nudity, and necrophilia. It is extremely transgressive for that. And then you have like kind of the side stuff, like Barbara Steele is a very liberated woman. She's married, but has multiple lovers. I mean, how are you supposed to feel about that? Is it a liberated thing? Or, in this very conservative country at the time, no, that's bad. You need to be punished for that. You can't do that. So of course, she dies. But because everyone dies, there you go. Because everyone dies, the movie can get away with showing all this stuff. The movie itself is, for a gothic horror film, is fairly bloodless. There's not much blood to it. I mean, one guy gets like a candelabra to the face and he gets burned. And there's a snake that gets chopped up, which is pretty sad because I think it's a real snake.
Yes.
Yeah. Italians do not treat animals good. Don't watch Cannibal Holocaust looking for a PETA endorsement. But it's still a fairly bloodless film compared to what Italians would be doing in the 70s and 80s. But for its social transgressive stuff, it is in this film. And that's stuff you weren't really seeing at the time quite yet in other Italian genre films. Bava's movie comes close. In fact, Bava's Black Sabbath, the first sequence in that film, the telephone call, has implied lesbianism in that too. But Castle Blood, I think, came out before. So, I beat you to the race, Mario.
And isn't Barbara Steele in Black Sabbath or Black Sunday?
Black Sunday.
Black Sunday. Okay.
Hey, her face, like the movie poster for Black Sunday, like that is like unmistakable. She has a very distinct face.
Remember, you can find the Fan2Fan Podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan2Fan Podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN. On Instagram at Fan2Fan Podcast. Or on Twitter at Fan2Fan Podcast. We'd love to hear from you, so send a message and let us know what you think of the show. Thanks.
And now, on with the show.
So I was going to ask you, Nick, about the direction of the film, because looking up the movie, not only did I run into different run times, which then you answered with, the production and how it was made for different markets. So that explains that. But then I saw it had 2 directors, Sergio Corbucci and Margheriti. I'm aware of Corbucci in from Spaghetti Western, The Great Silence. He's the other Sergio that's not Leone. I guess he initially directed this and then Margheriti either took over. So if you can, I wanted to figure out what that was, because then I also read how I guess Corbucci had directed some other film, and in very Corman-like fashion, I guess the producers, the money people were like, well, let's take advantage of the sets. So let's just shoot another film, and Corbucci couldn't. Margheriti stepped in.
I think Margheriti directed 90% of this film. So so over in Italy, directors are a lot more friendly with each other in terms of creating films. You probably don't see that in America too much. Usually, you bring in a second director because something's gone wrong. Oh my God, Han Solo movie, what have you done? Bring in Ron Howard to fix this. Since the genre production line in Italy, the directors are a lot more friendly. It's like, hey, I got a job. You want to be part of it? Or, hey, I don't really want to do this. You want to take over for me or something? That was actually very common to do because, these folks were, they were churning out movies fairly quickly using the same actors, actresses, sets, crew. A lot of it was very interchangeable. So it wasn't so much like, I am a big movie Mongol and I want a Christopher Nolan type movie, but Christopher Nolan's not available. Who's a very Christopher Nolan? Give me the Mexican counterpart of Steven Spielberg. Simpsons reference there. You didn't really have that in this era. The directors were very interchangeable. You could leave, Margheriti could take off and another director could come in, and that was fairly common. To do some swapping, some handshaking. Hey, can you take this over for me? So I believe for Castle Blood, it started off with Corbucci. For whatever reason, he couldn't do it, I think because of another film. They brought in Margheriti, and Margheriti, shot all he could. And I think, because of time crunch, he brought Corbucci back in to shoot another scene or something. But it's weird how nebulous it is. It was a lot of other directors might be a first unit director, but or even a special effects director that would still wind up maybe shooting more of the movie than intended because of other circumstances. The end result is, hey, this is a Margheriti film, but maybe 30% of it was actually done by Deodato. Oh, hey, here is a Bava film, but maybe 50% of it was actually a Riccardo Freda film. So that's how I take Castle Blood. I take umbrage with, I don't want to be mean-spirited in this, but Tim Lucas, guy behind Vito Watchdog, very influential guy. He put out a big, giant book on Mario Bava called All the Colors of the Dark. And so if you've got an extra $2 million laying around, you could buy this book. It's way out of print. It's like this big. But he has a chat, he goes through all Bava's films. When I say he goes by all Bava's films, not just Bava directed. Bava had a pinky in a film. He considered that a Bava film. And I could kind of see that. Again, like I said before, a first unit director might become the director for a good chunk of the film. And who does that film belong to? If you take the auteur theory, you'll, scream your head off. That doesn't make sense. If you take a more exploitation film approach, it's a more communal thing. I think Tim Lucas had written about Castle Blood that Bava had a bit of script involved in it. And in his book, he said something along the lines of Castle Blood, anything good in that film is because Bava wrote it, and anything bad in that film is because Margheriti directed it. I've always taken oh, come on, that's mean. I don't care for that part. But it does speak to how interchangeable, I guess, or how fluid is probably a better term, that the genre film industry was for Italy, because they were cranking out dozens, if not hundreds of movies a year across all these genres. And again, these directors, Sergio Leone may be known for his spaghetti westerns, but guess what? All these folks had their hands in a lot of different genre buckets, and they brought their appropriate trademarks and hallmarks, actually, I should say, and visions and stuff accordingly.
There seems to be like a utilitarianism to a lot of Italian cinema when it comes with the directors, like being interchangeable. And I don't mean that from a standpoint that they're not aesthetically pleasing, because they are, and they have styles, but like just in terms of we'll work in multiple genres because this is what we have to do, making just shooting what needs to be shot, and then you'll take this out later depending on the market. I don't know if that's unique to Italian cinema, but that's certainly unique to growing up in America and not experiencing really much of that at all.
During the Italy's golden age, they were definitely, I would say, the pioneers of that. But you would see that kind of cropping up in other cinema. I would say Eastern cinema, Jeffrey Ho films, probably descended upon that Italian filmmaking style. So I think it was popping up in other countries much later. It probably definitely not at the industrious level that Italy was doing it, because Italy was a machine, and it allowed them to make auteur cinema, because guess what? We can release this Fellini film and it will bomb, but we just raked in a lot of money from our, spaghetti westerns that it's a drop in the bucket. Our industry is still supported. We've made money elsewhere, and we can take those chances on the Pasolinis, the Antonini, all those, other folks.
The utilitarianism almost feels again like there's like an assembly line aspect to some of these where it's like 50% art, 50% the commodity, the product of it. It seems like in some of these Italian films, like you said, like you have switch hitters that kind of come in and out, and that's okay. There's less of a argument about, all right, well, Carbucci and Margheriti can be listed as directors on this.
Unless you tell me what that scene that Carbucci shot was in Cast of Blood, I wouldn't be able to pick it out.
It's all pretty seamless. There's a book Stephen Thrower wrote called Beyond Terror, the films of Lucio Fulci. And side note, if I could rewind a couple minutes, I said earlier, Argento's probably the first, Bava's the second.
Fulci.
I forgot. Fulci's definitely second or third there for sure, and then way past that. But Thrower puts out the question: is Lucio Fulci an auteur? Because we know Lucio Fulci, zombie. He does all these gory horror films from the 80s that we really know him from. But he rejects that term for Fulci because of Fulci dabbled in so many genres that he doesn't really have a singular, kind of focus. B, he kind of equates a lot of these directors to tradesmen and craftsmen. It's a very industrious thing to be a Italian director, that it's more of you're a craftsman and the film is the final craft that you've put out. And so he rejects that auteur label and labels, Fulci as more of a craftsman in that. And to me, that made sense. And it described a lot of Italian filmmakers, especially Antonio Margheriti. In fact, when I did my thesis, I basically regurgitated that back, saying Margheriti, it's not an auteur. He's got hallmarks, Margheriti's models, Margheriti's models. Margheriti definitely focuses on speculative fiction. All his films kind of fall into that fantastique of either horror, sci-fi. He was really big into sci-fi. So, in his early career, he basically carved out Italian space operas. He was the only one doing it. But, all his films up into the 80s before he went into more mercenary films are all very fantastic, speculative fiction, horror, sci-fi. And so, they all have kind of their preferences. And, one director may like close-ups of eyeballs more than another or something like that.
So you talk about eyeballs in Fulci, like those dots connect all the time. All right. Well, beyond production, Nick, and maybe this is more a question for you, Pete. Maybe then, Nick, you got to stay out of this for a second. So Pete and I can discuss amongst ourselves. Plotting wise, Blackwood, the guy who owns this mansion, says, I'm going to give you a 10 spot if you stay over, and I bet that you won't make it through the night on this All Hallows Eve. And he gets there, supernatural hilarity ensues. He doesn't make it through, right? And he's seeing these apparitions in rooms and trying to decipher what this is real, if he's going mad. It has those moments of like Harker in Dracula's castle, where it's like, I'm seeing a bunch of crazy shit, but I don't know if it's me, or like, am I tired, or am I missing my wife, or is this guy trying to suck my blood? I don't know. It's one of those things, right? So Alan's walking around doing this stuff. And then at the end of the movie, after we get that O. Henry ending, I got this sense, Pete, that Blackwood is basically maybe feeding the house or the victims, luring them. So he's going to this tavern and basically saying, all right, well, you're here in Ewantown, or maybe you're passing through. I'm going to bet that you can't stay in this place. And then a few people on this one night take him up on the offer. He lures them in. And I think they make a comment at some point, and Nick, don't say anything, that maybe Blackwood is a sadist, or there's something like he's not a good guy. And at the end, I was like, wait a second, is he doing this all on purpose? Is he grabbing these folks to appease the spirits, to appease the house, to feed the hunger? Did you get that read at all?
A little bit. I got more of the greed aspect of it, where he's like, this is an easy way for me to make bank, because I just got to find some suckers that'll go into this house because I know they're going to get killed. He clearly knows. And because they allude to the ghosts, and the entities allude to him as being like the worst of the Blackwoods, I believe.
Yes. Yes.
Like he's not a good guy. And then there's that scene at the end where he's like reaches into Alan Foster as he's hanging from the gate, reaches in and grabs his wallet and takes out his money and like pockets it, where I just took it as like, oh, well, this guy knows he's got like a sure thing going here. And so it's like, so every year I'll just sucker some more people in. I think he was intrigued because it's made apparent that Alan Foster is not wealthy. And he's like, I can only do £5 sterling or £10 sterling on this bet.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh, that's really interesting. You will do it for that little money. So that, like, in a way, to me, as I was thinking after having watched it, was that kind of piqued Blackwood's curiosity a little bit, because it's probably so used to these rich people, like the rich married couple coming in and be like, oh, well, I can get a lot of money from them. But here's someone that's willing to do for so little money. It's almost like, well, I have not experienced this in a while, so this will be fun. Let me put this guy up to the night of terror. So I took it more from the money making greed factor than I did the angle you took. But I think
like another sinister motivation, more about greed.
Like the more practical sinister motivation. But I think you could
maybe the most sinister. Yes,
right. But I think you can read it both ways. And again, I think that goes back to my original point, observing that lesbian angle where there's like the dialogue of, don't tell him your secret. No man will ever, or you'll never be able to love a man. You can read it two ways, because you've got the metaphysical and the supernatural aspect of it. Like, well, you can't because you're dead, and so you can't have this relationship. But when you see what's going on subversively, and I think that's why I like this movie so much, because I think what I associate with a lot of films from this period, even the Hammer films, is they're very upfront and they're very on the surface. Yes, you can go a little bit with the eroticism of Christopher Lee's Dracula and things like that, but a lot of this is very surface stuff. And here, again, you're operating on a different level. And I like that. I like going back to these movies that I've missed, especially one that's, made in the 60s and that is doing something, especially for the time. Like, this is before we're getting a lot of that freedom of expression that burst forth, Nick, like you mentioned earlier, that would come about in the 70s, sexual revolution stuff. Here's something going on, years before that. So I like that. I think that's very interesting.
So this is where, if I did have to think of flaw in the film, is I think it's both clever, but the writing doesn't quite support it. All the ghosts, they have their motivations for what they do singularly. Julia wants Barbara Steele. Barbara Steele wants both her husband and the hunky guy. Foster wants Barbara Steele. Alan Camus is just there to, research death. They all wind up killing each other. They all want to live another year, hence why they need blood, which is kind of shaky on that. So when you get to the end of the film, Alan dies. He's impaled by the gate. But if you start thinking about that, like, well, the ghosts didn't get to him. The ghosts didn't feed on his blood. What's their fate now? Because immediately after that, you hear the disembodied voice of Barbara Steele and Alan Foster, like, oh, they're together. So in a way, it sounds like, if you want to say, like, the curse has been lifted, the haunt has been dispelled, no one got their blood, so maybe they are returning to their rightful resting place. Or does it count that even, he still didn't make it through the night, he was impaled by the gate, even though the zombie vampire ghost didn't feast on his blood, the house as an entity still claimed its victim. And so everyone, including now Foster, will appear a year from now.
And just for the record, the front lawn of this castle is a graveyard.
Yes,
just for anyone that hasn't watched this, it's very atmospheric in that way. But our poor guy Alan did not make it very far.
No, he didn't. But when you start thinking about that, it does. The movie starts to kind of fall apart a little bit of what's these ghosts' motivation to actually live another year? Because, if they're haunted and they feel anchored, just don't kill anyone next year and then you're released or something like that. So when I was rewatching this film, something I was cognizant of, but I didn't think of a label when I wrote my thesis, but it makes perfect sense now, is the movie's a time loop. The ghosts are all in a time loop. Much like Groundhog Day as the most famous one out there. The ghosts are more or less in a time loop, reliving their last, I think one of the characters says 5 minutes of death in this house. But I don't think the writing, it's one of those things where the writing is like, that sounds like a great idea. How can we support that? I'm not sure. And that goes back to, I think, motivation behind the original character that triggers all this, Blackwood. Because I don't think it's greed. The reason I say that is, this is a moment of very black comedy for me. At the very end, they arrive by carriage. Foster's dead. He is impaled on the gate. And Blackwood does not have to claim the wager. He doesn't. That's kind of very Black humor that he reaches into his pocket, takes out his wallet. But here's the deal. He could take the entire contents of that wallet, but he doesn't. He only takes the wager out and puts the wallet back.
And he does offer to bury Allan too, as he tells Poe,
Correct.
like, I will take care of the arrangements.
Mm-hmm. And which I think is the foreshadowing that all this stuff now plus Allan will repeat next year. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think it's a greed thing. It might, and I don't think it's a quite feeding the house thing either. I think there's something a bit more gentlemanly manny. That's not a real word, but more of a principle type thing for Blackwood. If Foster never showed up to talk to Poe, what was Blackwood going to do that night? He might not have even done anything. But the story dictates that every year. Like Cthulhu, the stars must align. Is Blackwood really going to wait 1 year to find the one person to convince him to stay the night in his haunted castle to win a couple bucks? That is a lot of effort. So the next time, again,
Foster's in there. Yes.
Yeah. Depending on how you take the ending, because they didn't actually feast on Foster's blood, is everyone released? Or does it count anyway? And now Foster is part of the time loop. And so every year he's going to be running out to that cemetery and gets,
almost get there. Well, then you wonder, blood is meant to be literal. Or is it the idea that they're not actually going after his blood, but the blood is the representation of life? And that's maybe what they're going after?
The Camus character makes it really overt that, blood's the fountain. They need blood. Mm-hmm. But again, if you're, it is The Castle of Blood. It's a gothic horror film. It's not supposed to be taken this deep. But so when you take it this deep, it's when it starts to unravel a little bit, which makes it fun. I think it's just that gothic trope of you need a haunted house. Why is the house haunted? Because these ghosts come back every year. Why? Because this guy leads them there. Why? But it adds that kind of sentientness to the house, even though the house is not like, alive. But, it has doors that don't open. What's in theory, Foster could leave at any time. He doesn't, and then tries to. It is too late. But there really isn't, there isn't like, we never see like a spectral force field keeping him in. We don't see every single thing bolted and shuttered. But I think on the other hand, that's all part of our audience filling in those imagination blanks. One other thing is, depending on what edit you're watching, the reasons and rationales for everyone completely change. The English dub will be different than an Italian dub.
There's another wrinkle, like a funky wrinkle in Castle of Blood, where Carmus is almost acting as like ghost of Christmas past, like leading Foster around, and showing him all the deaths that these spirits have to relive.
Yep.
And then he has to also relive his own, but he's also cognizant of what's going on. So he's like, he knows what's happening, but then still compelled to relive the death. But you don't get the sense that the others are almost staged as like a scene from a play, and Foster's kind of just, at the whim of having to see this. I don't know exactly where my brain is going with that, but I just thought it was like another interesting wrinkle that if you think too much about it, it's like, does this all line up? Does this all make sense? Why does Carmus have like this extra ability to kind of like lead someone through? And is it because he was doing all of this research on death that he's got this extra ability? And I'm already thinking probably way too deep than I need to about this movie, but that's where I was going.
They're all cognizant of it. I think the logic of the film is, for this one night, they're all alive. They're not ghosts. They're dead, but they're not ghosts. They're physical. They can interact with things. We know that because Foster makes sexy time with Barbara Steele. And it's only until at midnight or chronology when their violent death happened that I think they stop being alive and technically free-willed. And that's when they go on autopilot to relive, their death scene. And then after that's over, they are now I'm in zombie mode. I need to drink your blood. So I think there's 3 phases of these folks' undeadness. And it's that first phase where, maybe they're waiting for Blackwood to send them their victim. They're cognizant of what it is because, Julie is telling Barbara Steele's character, don't tell him what's going on. He doesn't need to know the truth of all this. And I think some other characters, probably can't control themselves. That's why the spurn lover runs in and kills Barbara Steele. But that's kind of how I take it as, the pawn piece is being set up, then, their deaths play out, and then the final encore is their victim, they hunt him down and drink his blood. So that whole play, as you put it, which is probably a good way to put it, they're marionettes to be staged for the next year.
Not to take anything away from this version, Nick, Castle of Blood, 1964, but as we wrap up, I wanted to ask you about the remake, the reboot. I guess Margheriti directed it again in 1970, and I wanted to ask you what's
Web of the Spider.
Okay.
It's called Web of the Spider. I have watched it long ago, and it's basically, when Castle Blood came out, it didn't do the box office numbers it should have, I think, probably because it was very transgressive. Even though the characters got their appropriate societal comeuppances, even Margheriti thought, it was a slow film and he didn't like it. So he remade it. He remade it in color with Klaus Kinski. And now Klaus Kinski plays the Edgar Allan Poe role. So it's a small role. I have not watched it in a long time, but I remember watching it and thinking that's part of the appeal, I think, of Gothic horror is it doesn't have to exclusively be color, but the black and white Gothic horrors ooze that atmosphere. And I think one of the big things that works with Castle Blood is the same thing that works for Carnival of Souls. It is extremely slow build, like Pete said, it does drag in the middle. And I think that's a feature, not a bug, of letting that atmosphere stew and simmer for a while. But anyway, the black and whiteness of Castle Blood, I can't imagine it in color. And guess what? You can with Web of the Spider. To me, the fact that I'm just drawing a blank is just kind of how unremarkable and unnecessary it was.
Well, when you mentioned black and white and compared to color, it reminded me of the tone of Night Gallery. Serling and the people who worked on Night Gallery, that's what this felt like. If this was in color and Rod Serling had played it and it was 45 minutes long, I'm like, this would have been a Night Gallery episode for sure.
Especially since a Night Gallery episode, you could have the artwork of Julie that appears in the film appear
100%. Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
For Gothic tropes, though, this movie is a sponge and it is being wrung for as much Gothicness. You want spider-webbed covered candelabras. You want doors that don't open. You want big gowns and full moon silhouetted castles and everything. And I appreciate it for that movie. I recommend to folks. I'm a little sad that it's still relegated to third tier status. Any time to kind of help raise the status of this film to general consciousness, and by extension, Antonio Margheriti, I am all for it. So thanks for letting me talk about it.
I'm glad that for a movie that you've talked about highly, I would have enjoyed it either way, but I'm glad that I think, in watching it, Pete, it seems like you felt the same way. I was like, it wasn't like hey, Nick, we're going to have you on to talk about it, but I'm going to put on my countdown app and, let's just get this over with, because I did not enjoy this film.
It totally kept my interest. I just want to commend myself for my restraint from not making a Tony Danza joke, because I believe this is called Danza Macabra in Italian.
Yeah,
and I had it ready, but I was like, you know what, I'm going to refrain.
Danza Macabre means, Dance of Death, which was, a big painting and other stuff back in the day. And it's also the Stephen King book when he wrote his book on how to write. I think it was called Dance Macabre.
Yes.
Watching it, I was waiting. I'm like, it would have been cool to see an entire series of films where you have him basically do the same thing, right? Like, I'm in a bar writing my stories, trying to get inspired. And then this guy comes in and he's like, hey, by the way, I've got this mansion where a bunch of spirits live in it. And let's get this guy to stay over there that night. All of these stories are happening around Poe. And it turns out that his stories are just him documenting them later, and taking some liberties. He would be the narrator to be like, I'm going to tell you about the real tale of what inspired me to write this story.
Traveling around Europe, hopping into a different city in each episode.
That would have worked so awesome in the 80s when you had anthology shows like Tales from the Dark Side.
Yes. Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
Well, I know who could pull off a young Edgar Allan Poe. He's right in front of y'all. It's Herbert West, Reanimator. Oh, crap. Jeffrey Combs.
Jeffrey Combs. Yeah, good call. Yep, that's it.